Personally speaking, I was so excited that Netflix finally got the funding for a German language World War I movie. Only thing, the movie did not really deserve the title All Quiet on the Western Front, as it's so far apart from the original content. With all the stories of German soldiers that fought during World War I really think that they missed a brilliant opportunity to bring a new story to the big screen. To me, this Netflix version portrays World War I as if it was a video game. Very stereotypical trenches, blood, and mud. And the movie wants to push horror so much that it becomes cartoonish gore. The 2022 Netflix version is actually the third remake of Maria-Éric Remarque's novel published in 1928. The first movie was released in 1930 and then another in 1979. I highly suggest you watch both of them. You know what, how about we skip the foreplay and just jump right in. Oh yeah, massive disclaimer, there will be a lot of spoilers in this video. In All Quiet on the Western Front, Faudray, V3. I don't get the sense that Paul and his classmates got any sort of training before being sent to the front. In reality, Éric Maria Remarque was drafted in November 1916, but only reached the front in June 1917. The boot camp and military training is important and was well portrayed in both the 1930 and 1979 versions. The only problem I have is that the movie makes it seem as if this entire cohort of young teenagers are sent at once to the front, when in reality Remarque said in the book that he and his classmates were replacements. Again, I think the movie missed out on this opportunity to talk about what it's like being a replacement that nobody trusts because you're a noob. This part is very good because it shows how the bulk of displacements for German soldiers was done by foot. And we can see how a lot of transportation was done by actual horses. In my opinion, it would have been even better to see Paul and his friends push some horse-drawn carriage or some howitzer through the mud like on the picture on the screen. And right after All Quiet on the Western Front also correctly wants to show the poor living conditions in the trenches, properly depicting the problem of mud the moment it was raining. But there's one detail that I thought was interesting. The soldiers keep walking through actual mud. When you look at World War I pictures, you'll notice that German trenches always have some sort of planks of wood on the ground to allow rapid movement through the alleyways, so as not to get actually stuck in the mud. So at one point, these green guys suffered their first bombardment, and all of a sudden the structure where they're in just collapses. And this is the aftermath. What the F happened here? Did the French reach killstreak 30 and just drop the nuke? Everything got just wiped out. The French wish that their artillery could cause that much damage. I counted at least 100 bodies. For a movie built upon gore to push the horrors of war, this scene seems pretty cartoonish. The bodies are all intact in plain sight. In reality, after a bombardment, Remarque spoke of distorted faces, arms and body parts sticking out, wounded men in the mud crying for help. He wrote, "Beside me a lance corporal has his head torn off. Blood spouts from his neck like a fountain." For me, that's true horror. I read this line a few days ago and it still sticks in my head. Imagine what it must have been like to experience this. Contrary to popular belief, trenches were the safest place to be during a bombardment. You have two choices, either being in the open or digging in. And this strategy is so efficient that it's still being used in Ukraine today. German trenches were also notorious for being extremely well built. Huge sections were reinforced with concrete, and they could easily endure shelling. I also think that the Netflix version of All Quiet on the Western Front is so over the top regarding the death of Paul's friends. We don't know what happened to his friend Franz. The first one dies after an atomic bomb blasts away German positions and somehow still manages to die from a headshot. In this next scene, they go out of their way to show how the French were merciless, taking no prisoner at all, when we know it's pure BS. Over 400,000 Germans were captured by the French. These German prisoners could reveal very important information. Now let's just burn them with a flamethrower. What the F? Then the other one. The war is over. He's alive and he kills himself by stabbing himself in the neck with a fork. Oh my god, it was super gore and so unnecessary. Is this some sort of sadistic horror movie? And lastly, Paul's closest friend, Kat, dies because of some kid shooting him in the stomach. So lame, so anticlimactic. Of all the ways soldiers could have died during World War I, they had to pick the most random ones. And the same goes for Paul's death. After choking and drowning a French soldier in mud, he dies from being stabbed in the back. I honestly felt nothing. How can I feel empathy for someone that spared no one? Overall, I feel the ending is less tragic, less emotional compared to the ending of the 1930 and 1979 versions. But I was still hopeful for the movie to bring something good. This scene behind me is the reason why I love this movie so much. You see a squad of German soldiers lined up. They all have the proper rifles, the proper uniforms. They're also covered in mud. Excellent. And I love this scene because it shows how poorly written this entire movie is. Take a look at this line of barbed wire in front of them. You can't go through it. Yet, a couple minutes later, poof, the barbed wire line is gone. And why is that so? The only purpose is for the German soldiers to be able to charge out in the open like dumbasses. So how did soldiers attack during World War I? Generally speaking, it depends at what point of the war, but here we're speaking about 1917-1918. When I went to Paris, I had the opportunity to visit the Invalides War Museum, and I stumbled upon a very interesting footage of the French assault on the Chemin des Dames in 1917. In reality, soldiers did not line up in their trenches and just all attack at once. They had special attack trenches, 4 positions that they dug to get as close as possible to enemy lines. The officer, the lieutenant, went out first, and then the entire platoon would move out one by one in column formation. And the platoon followed the lieutenant very closely. And then another platoon would go out of the trench, and so on. And in movies, they always put so many men and so much stuff in a small area of no man's land. It feels so claustrophobic. In reality, soldiers faced something like emptiness around them. They were surrounded by nothing. And most often than not, they were all alone. World War I was the first war where officers had a lot of problems with command and control because their men were so spread out. Compare what I just said to this scene right here where you see the Germans, a mass of German soldiers charging forward hectically like zombies. In reality, lieutenants would have whistles to make their positions known so their men could follow them. And the entire purpose was for every unit to actually maneuver throughout the battlefield, avoid strongholds, attempt to flank enemy positions at their weakest spot. Now, if the Germans had barbed wire in front of their trenches, we can assume that the French have the same thing on theirs. How can this mass of zombie German soldiers bypass the barbed wire? The answer is a rolling artillery barrage. This artillery barrage would destroy enemy obstacles, but its main goal would be to paralyze the enemy and force the defenders to keep cover. Usually the rate of advance of this barrage was 200 to 300 meters in 4 minutes. The success of an assault was determined by how synchronized the infantry was with the rolling barrage. If they're too fast, they'll be hit by their own artillery, and if they're too slow, the defenders will have recovered and will fire at them. This is why officers played an important role. They would constantly look at the watch and either tell their men to slow down or to hurry up. The first line was composed of demolition squads, whose task would be to blow up gaps into enemy lines and throw lots of grenades into enemy trenches. Some soldiers would carry up to 16 grenades and they would just throw them one after the other. On top of that, every assault platoon was equipped with 2 light machine guns, whose crews would advance with the infantry and provide direct fire support if needed. So as you can see, contrary to popular belief, it was the defenders that were really at a disadvantage during an assault. And what makes me so disappointed is that we have 100 years of material, of memoirs, of stories written. We know how it happened. Yet, movie directors prefer to just copy what other directors have done and they don't even check if it was accurate or not. It just looks cool. They highly prioritize entertainment compared to realism when they can do both. Overall, there's 2 storylines in the movie. There's the one with Matthias Erzberger that tries to sign the armistice with the French, and the one with Paul in the trenches. Halfway through the movie, we're presented with General Friedrichs, which in my opinion is heavily inspired by German General Ludendorff. Physically, they already look similar, and just like Friedrichs in the movie, Ludendorff was also extremely suspicious of social democrats and leftists. like Matthias Erzberger, portrayed by Daniel Brühl. This guy carries the entire movie. Strangely, the best scenes for me were the ones not original to the book. The scenes about the German Ministry of War and the entire thing about the negotiations about the armistice. Friedrichs and Ludendorff are both career German generals. Friedrichs, just like Ludendorff, thought that the armistice, the Treaty of Versailles, was a humiliation for Germany. And after the war, Ludendorff would push this idea that the German army was stabbed in the back by the leftist civilian government, which would then later lead to Nazism. However, unlike Friedrichs in the movie, Ludendorff was not a bloodthirsty general. In one of his memos on the 30th of March 1918, Ludendorff said, "The idea of compelling success by the employment of masses of troops must be absolutely eradicated. This merely leads to unnecessary losses. It is fire effect which is decisive and not numbers." By September 1918, Ludendorff saw that the war was over, the German army was finished, and most German generals agreed. What I didn't like in the movie is that General Friedrich sends his men on the last day of the war, November 11th, on one last assault just for glory. That's exactly what a cartoonish villain would do. Sadly, like critical drinkers said, a character is only as smart as the person writing it. For example, in this scene, just like a stereotypical bad guy, he watches the battle, the onslaught from the comfort of his manor. A one-dimensional villain. What the movie omits is that a lot of World War I generals had their sons fighting in the trenches, many of whom died. These generals were not insensitive to losses. In the scene, instead of telling his men to attack one last time, the movie could have foreshadowed Nazism. Friedrichs could have told his men that a new battle awaits them on the home front. A new battle against communism, against the ones that treacherously signed the armistice, the ones that betrayed the German nation. This scene is visually heartbreaking. You see all these men attacking and just see a cloud of red popping out, which basically depicts what happens if the defenders recover and get to the machine guns. They fire at point blank and it's just a massacre. Somehow, despite so many French machine guns lined up, the Germans managed to reach the French lines. Now we get to the good part. This entire trench clearing scene is pure mud and gore. But let me tell you, in reality, nobody wants to get stabbed. Hand-to-hand fighting was extremely rare. Whenever enemy troops would get too close, defenders would fire a couple rounds and then quickly pack up to go to the second line of defense. Obviously, they would not run out in the open. They would use communication trenches that would link the first and second line. "You were not there. How do you know this?" Eric Maria Remarque said it himself. "The forward trenches have been abandoned. We make for the rear. The machine guns are already firing from the next position. We crouch behind every corner, behind every barrier of barbed wire, and hurl heaps of explosives at the feet of the advancing enemy before we run. At least we reach a trench that is in a somewhat better condition. It is manned and ready for the counterattack." And this scene in the movie could have shown that. As the French troops get closer, an officer tells Paul and Kat to pack up the machine guns and take as much ammo as possible, as they're all withdrawing to a second line of defense. Sadly follows yet another uncoordinated, hectic run across the no man's land. And equally, the goal of this first wave of attacking infantry would not be to clear those trenches, especially not with bolt-action rifles and bayonets in such close and tight environments. Once they reach positions, officers would fire flares up in the air to signal that the position has been reached, and then the officer's role was to quickly gather his men and push as far as possible towards the second line of defense, to avoid the defenders from regrouping. The neutralization of the strongholds left behind was carried out after the assault by the second or even the third wave. More often than not, they would encircle the strongholds and just hurl dozens of grenades at it. And more often than not, this is where the defenders would simply surrender. This scene has a lot of good to it. It's an excellent portrayal of what adrenaline in combat during World War I could have looked like. And it's very similar to what's described in the book. During an attack, Remarque said that he and his friends were like automatons, having lost all feelings, savage and raging, and ready to kill. Remarque then talks about some hand-to-hand fighting with shovels and spades and stuff like that. Honestly, I don't even know if Remarque actually witnessed such events. He finds himself at the front in June-July 1917. At one point, he has to carry his best friend out of enemy fire, but eventually dies of head wound from a shrapnel splinter while he's being carried to a medic. And we see that this scene is in the book. A few days later, Remarque was himself injured by a grenade explosion, with splinters in his neck, left knee, and the right wrist. He then spends the rest of the war in a hospital in Germany. We don't exactly know what type of combat action he witnessed during the war. The story he wrote is fiction, and it's very possible that it's some sort of gathering of all the stories he heard from other wounded soldiers in the hospital, who probably told him imaginary battles about bayonets and choking and hitting with shovels. And since he didn't witness it, he just took it for granted. Also recall how Éric Maria Remarque wrote the novel in 1928, 11 years after his experience at the front. So it's very obvious that the story he wrote was tainted by a decade of post-war pacifism. What's ridiculous is that they carry out this trench clearing by themselves, like two guys versus an unknown amount of enemies. They don't even know the trench network they're fighting in, yet they overwhelm all the stupid defenders. Headshot, headshot, stab, stab. I wonder what kill streak you get after 10. I think at 10 you get that emergency airdrop, right? Because of drone footage in Ukraine, we see exactly how trench clearing is done. It's very coordinated, much slower. The attackers are very careful. Death awaits at every corner. And exactly because it's so slow, it was done by the second wave. Beautiful movie set, the aesthetics, the cosmetics are amazing. But there are things that I was like, what the... So this is the first line of defense. Why would the French have a bridge over their own trench? Why would they have all this barbed wire behind their lines and positioned at random like it's not even a straight line? CGI fail. It's like my little cousin when he plays Age of Empires and he just builds some parts of fortifications that are not even connected with each other. There's no purpose. And please, let's be honest, what is with the X-shaped barbed wire in the movie? It's straight from Battlefield 1 or what? It's not a secret. In reality, it was a line of wooden poles with barbed wire attached to them. And what made the enemy progression so difficult is that there were multiple lines of barbed wire to cross over, not the silly Age of Empire 1 scene in the movie. The next scene is very interesting, and I think this is where you really step into the movie. The German soldiers reform lines and await the French counterattack. However, this version of the movie, instead of just having French soldiers coming at them, you see a line of Saint-Chamond tanks slowly moving forward. You hear all the clicks and the rolling and all the steel, and you truly feel this fear because you feel that the Germans can't do anything about it. Historically speaking, it would have been nice to see some Renault FT in action, but yeah. Because of their big cannons, the Saint-Chamond were mainly to fire at enemy artillery positions, which were kilometers away. In this next part, we see the true horror of war, and the movie successfully done so with very shocking scenes. The Germans lose all cohesion, just flee. Some wounded guy in the mud gets run over to death by his own comrades. You see a tank crush a soldier. An officer gets evaporated from an explosion. Paul and his friends are screaming out of fear. Now the movie missed another brilliant opportunity to make this scene even more horrific. I highly recommend you this German movie from 1930 called Westfront 1918. You see the French tanks just going over the trenches and moving forward. The French soldiers would attack by jumping from one crater to another until they reach enemy positions. According to doctrine, French infantry would closely follow behind the tanks. The tanks would protect them from enemy fire. The tanks would slowly move forward and would crush enemy defenses, and the Germans were powerless. As the tanks would slowly move towards the trenches, French infantrymen would fire their light machine guns to pin down the enemy and then throw grenades at them as they move forward to annihilate the defenders still in the trenches. All Netflix had to do was to recreate the scenes you just saw with modern technology. Now if we look at the part where they throw grenades inside the Saint-Chamond, it's properly done, but it's also weird considering it's allegedly the first time they see such machines. This is video game stuff. Infantry was also right behind to protect them from such things from happening. In my opinion, this scene would have been much more realistic if they had thrown the grenades inside the tank from a trench. Let's take a closer look to the flamethrowers. for a movie with such an emphasis on gore. The flamethrowers here are exactly the same as in Battlefield 1. It feels as if they're just holding a hose and watering their plants in the garden. Flamethrowers in reality had a range of 40 yards. And it was not just fire they projected, but almost like napalm. That means that the soldiers would not burn, they would melt. Truly horrific. As you can imagine, defenders did not want to suffer such a horrible death, so they would run away way before. And generally speaking, the French stopped using flamethrowers after the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Flamethrowers were very dependent on the direction of the wind. They were very heavy, so the crews carrying them were very slow, and overall they could not safely be used in open terrain. Since the crews can't duck for cover as easily, flamethrowers could really only be used from within a trench. Generally speaking, the French preferred to send some nettoyeurs de tranchées to clear the trenches. They would be armed with light machine guns, pistols, and grenades. It was much faster. What I find interesting in this movie is that a lot of action is taking place in the no man's land when there's absolutely no cover. If only the soldiers would fight from one crater or foxhole to another. But here they really want to show these slow-walking flamethrower juggernauts to push this fear factor. The French could have simply positioned a couple light machine guns and just fire at anyone standing. Equally, the Germans could have set up some machine gun positions to cover the retreat of their own men. Overall, the Netflix All Quiet on the Western Front is not a bad movie, it's just that we didn't need it on the remake of already excellent movies. Director Edward Berger also tried to make 2 movies in one, but to achieve such a goal would have required multiple episodes to really flesh out all the characters. As for combat scenes, entertainment was largely prioritized compared to realism. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you like the information I just provided, make sure to support me on Patreon or PayPal.